Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you all for attending this breakfast, this NAIDOC week breakfast. My name is Nina Maguire and I am delighted to be the MC today. I am a proud member of the team here at SHAPE. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land of which we gather today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have cared for this land for more than 70,000 years, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. Today on our panel we are joined by Peter Marix-Evans, the CEO at SHAPE. Peter was appointed CEO in 2017 and he brings 30 years of wide-ranging industry experience with roles in across the commercial and public sectors. We're also joined by Ellen Monavari, the Senior Manager of Operations Transformation at the Green Building Council of Australia. Ellen is an award-winning sustainability leader committed to transformational change. Over her 20-year career, she's contributed much to sustainability in the built environment, including leading the creation of the new Green Star Homes rating tool for the Green Building Council of Australia. We're also joined by Jifa Greenaway, the founding director of Greenaway Architects. Jifa, a well-known Kamilaroi man, is a nationally recognised architect, academic, design advocate and a regular design commentator on ABC Radio Melbourne. Over 2 decades, he's championed Indigenous-led design thinking, particularly as co-author of the International Indigenous Design Charter. And last but not least, we're joined by Susan Moylan-Combs, a founding director at the Guy Marigal Group. Susan's ancestry is Wollonga and Gringery from the Northern Territory, and she has extensive experience working with First Australian communities nationally and internationally, with specific expertise in community consultation, empowerment and the facilitation of voice and storytelling. Susan has contributed to Indigenous broadcasting through her roles at the ABC and NITV and now sits on a number of boards and committees. Our panellists today will be discussing SHAPE's involvement with the Green Building Council of Australia's addition of the Indigenous Inclusion Credit in Green Star. The credit incorporates the guiding principles of the Australian Indigenous Design Charter, which was led by Jifa, and meeting the Indigenous Inclusion Credit is simplified by engaging consultants and Aboriginal people like Susan and Jifa. We will also explore the current systems and resources available and how the construction industry can play a role in responding fully to this year's NAIDOC theme, Get Up, Stand Up, Show Up. Now to my first question. This year's NAIDOC theme of Get Up, Stand Up, Show Up calls for all Australians to come together beyond action, to come together to demand action beyond acknowledgement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their lands, waters, sacred sites and cultural heritage. So this question's open to the whole panel. How have you seen the property industry play a role in driving change and action towards this? And I think we'll start with you, Susan.
I'd like to start by saying Warami, Nagaya Susan, Nagaya Grinji Wawonga, Gumada Bianga, Gumada Waranga, Madamarong Tianaga Anaga, Madamarong Balia, Gadigal Gori Pemel. So hello, I'm Susan, I'm Grinji Wawonga, with deep honour and respect. I asked to speak to the male spirits, I asked to speak to the female spirits of Gadigal country, for all of us to be here today to walk and talk, show up, stand up and all of those things. NAIDOC is something that we as First Nations people participate in to celebrate who we are. And this year I think it's an interesting theme that it's really about asking all of us to show up and to take a stand, to really look at the history, look at where we've come from, understand we are the oldest living culture on the planet. I'm speaking really fast, I know. That you know, we predate what you know as Australia. So I'm not an Aboriginal woman because that's a colonial term. And Australia is a nation, and the Australian realm, we are still sovereign people, and how we show up into these spaces and how we can contribute to the built environment and design and architecture and construction, I think has been a long time coming, because we need to stop just designing and building boxes. We really need to honour and respect country first, honour and respect people from country, and then the fundamental, have a relationship with who we are as the original people, and we have rights, and acknowledging those rights and and sharing some of that power with us. Because we were here before what you know as Australia. So what does that mean for us moving forward as a nation, as a population who we live here on this same place? So how can we inform what's special about who we are, what's special about the country, or you know, when I say country, nation, First Nation, because that will create better buildings and better spaces for people to be in.
Yamamalia. Hello friends. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded sovereign lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's always nice to come back here, given I was born on Gadigal country, grew up on Darkinjung country, and now live and work on Kulin Nation country, Wurundjeri country. And you know, I guess significantly a week like this provides that pause and respite to understand the contribution that First Nations people have offered and shared here in the Australian context. And importantly, the built and natural environment has actually been complicit in the colonial story. And so really a lot of the work that we do as practitioners in the built and natural environment is to, I guess, deal with some of the difficult truths, and ultimately we can also be part of the solution. And so what we also know is that we've burnt country, we've felled country, we've poisoned country. The bloodstains of our people are encoded in country. But ultimately we have a responsibility and obligation as practitioners to use our skills and our capacities to actually hold a mirror up to society and say that we actually have, you know, a huge amount of responsibility. And if we look at the challenges around biodiversity loss and climate change, ultimately we can utilise our various capacities to inform a different way of thinking. And ultimately, you know, as I see it, we need to design of country, with country, for country. And you can see this sort of country-centred approach is pivotal to our ways of working, and ultimately there is a great story to be told. You know, ultimately people are looking for authentic connections to place, and what better way than to start with our layers of history and memory of place and start to, you know, give voice to the voiceless, facilitate you know, true agency, self-determination and opportunity for Indigenous enterprise, Indigenous voices as part of our collective story. There's great generosity among First Nations people to share their stories, but ultimately we can't do this alone. We constitute a very small proportion of the population, and if the starting premise that all projects are built on Indigenous lands, then we all have a part to play, and we can start to build those affinities, those relationships, those allyships, so as we can start to push in the same direction.
Okay, just the mic is going around. Well, good morning everyone, and again I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as well. Now my take on this is going to obviously be different because both of you spoke so beautifully and eloquently, and what the GBCA and what Green Star does through the rating tool is look at opportunities to recognise different initiatives that are implemented. I think just building on what you've just said, Jifa, the foundations of a lot of the work that we do is really around of land and where a building is going to be located, and hence the way that Green Star has sought to implement some of these initiatives is through the rating tool. This started many years ago in the communities rating tool. For example, there was an initial credit which focused, yes, a bit more on like culture, heritage and identity, but we've sort of built on that over time. And what Green Star does also is to acknowledge emerging trends and issues, and we do that through what's called innovation challenges. So there was a Reconciliation Action Plan Innovation Challenge, and at the time when that was introduced, there wasn't many reconciliation action plans, but we've seen certainly a significant uptake of those from property companies and those working in the built environment. And then again, building on that was another innovation challenge, which was really looking at the kind of things that you were speaking of, Jifa and Susan, which is around really incorporating these principles into the design of the building. But I think one of the foundations, and this is what you've both spoken to so greatly is that you need to start with a deep sense of listening, and really to do that engagement, it needs to be done up front. It can't be done as a tack-on. It needs to be authentic and it needs to be true. So some of these principles are things that we have incorporated into the new credit, and it really is around the foundation has to be the place where it is and being very localised. So really having that deeper connection to the local community and listening and having that inform the design right from the beginning, because if all buildings do it, then all places and our connections to it are going to look very different moving forward. So I guess that's sort of like the Green Star and the GBCA story.
Thanks for that. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today and pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and certainly to those Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders here with us today. So very hard to follow on from the three speakers, so that's why I wanted to go last, just to create a bit of a point of difference there. First of all, also a really warm welcome to Shapes Home, so thank you for coming today and for joining us here. We're very proud of our home and we love to show it off. We moved in December and then we went into lockdown, so we moved back out. So it's great to actually have our faces and that sort of stuff here. So just quickly on the the get up, stand up, show up. I think for me it's really what we're doing today. So the get up is to hold events like this and to create opportunities to listen to people that actually really know about these topics, and as you say, to listen authentically. So the get up, the show up is pretty easy. You're all here, you've turned up, you've showed up to listen to it, to be part of the conversation. And I think going forward, that's what we need to continue to do, is to address these issues and to have the conversations, because if we just try to sort of put it under the rug, it's not going to go anywhere. But the most important part is actually what we do after this. So it's quite good to come here and to listen, to be a part of it. But as we leave here, what are we actually going to do going forward to stand up and to continue that message and to take it back to our own workplaces and homes and that sort of stuff.
Thank you. And Ellen, in your answer, you touched on Green Star. So I would love to hear from Pete and Jifa about how the Indigenous inclusion credit was incorporated into Green Star.
Yeah, thanks. So Michael Manicus, who is not with us today, is just travelling with visiting his wife's family. So Michael, I think, approached Davina Rooney from the Green Building Council and talking through their credits suggested that we look at some Indigenous inclusion credits, not necessarily knowing the full detail of what we could do and how we could do it, but certainly to start to bring it in. There has been innovation credits available for some time, but to make it a more designated criteria to really bring conversation to it. And I think that's where Jifa came into it with your your work on the Indigenous Design Charter.
Yeah, so it's probably worth contextualising the Charter. So the Australian and the International Indigenous Design Charter, of which I was a co-author along with Megan Kelly, Russell Kennedy and Brian Martin, was 10 years in the making. So we spoke to First Nations people around the globe because what we realised is there was risk to sort of, I guess, appropriate Indigenous design through design practice. And so by developing a series of protocols which embedded both respect and a culturally responsive design methodology through a series of protocols, we were able to essentially pressure test how one goes about Indigenous design inclusion and consideration. And so importantly, what those various 10 protocol points raise is issues around Indigenous cultural intellectual property protocols, how we embed deep listening, how we facilitate issues around ensuring that Indigenous voice is embedded as part of the normative practice, and a whole host of other dimensions. But the first one, critically, is wherever there is an opportunity to embed Indigenous perspectives, sensibilities and knowledge systems, it is Indigenous-led. And so what that enables is true voice unmediated. And so plugging into how that relates to creating its relationship to the Green Building Council is it enables us to foreground the importance of the process of how we go about this. So I think people understand and have certainly thought about the why, and I think the penny has dropped. We realise the value of embedding Indigenous perspectives into projects, but it's the how which is the biggest challenge. So this becomes a mechanism to essentially pressure test one's own processes and methodology, and do it in a way where we can actually really showcase and celebrate the opportunities that it raises.
Thank you. And Ellen, how can organisations obtain the Indigenous inclusion credit?
So just building again on what Jeeve has said, the credit has, apologies, two sort of pathways. One of them is if an organisation has a reconciliation action plan, then demonstrating that the project is a key part of that. There's people from the project team part of the working group, etc. So that's one pathway. Then the other pathway really is to look at incorporating the Indigenous design principles, and we have outlined the fact that we want at least 4 of the core principles embedded right from the beginning, and the Indigenous-led being the critical one, and having it being very responsive to the local needs as well. And so I think, and the advice that I would give to projects that are looking at this as well is, again, start early, because that engagement piece is the thing that is going to be the transformational aspect of the project. It's not necessarily only going to be what comes out as a design. It is really around trying to listen. And I mean, if I reflect on a previous role that I had, I used to work at Transport for New South Wales. I was working on a project upgrading train stations for accessibility, and as part of that, I felt it was very important to recognise that every one of those stations is on Aboriginal land. And so again, it was trying to look at opportunities to do that engagement, but it does take time, and often projects are very fast-tracked, and I think in order for it to be authentic, you need to allow the time and be open to that listening, because it can uncover some really uncomfortable truths as well that I think are quite challenging for a lot of people to recognise. So I think part of the process will be to be open to that as well, and then also looking at opportunities to leverage and incorporate some of those stories into the building as well, and the opportunities to then communicate that back out to community.
Yeah. And Peter, what for you is the significance of the Indigenous inclusion credit for companies like SHAPE and the industry?
Yeah, so I think it puts the focus onto Indigenous design and having respect and care for our First Nations. So I was lucky enough to be part of the team that worked on 30 The Bond, so one of the first 5-star commercial ABGR 5-star Green Star buildings, and that was back in 2003. If you look at where we've come from as an industry now, back then sort of almost feeling our way, to now having some really well-established criteria, and we've had the innovation credits there available to look at Indigenous sort of connections to land and to country, but it hasn't necessarily been that clear for industry. So for those with a lot of overheads or a lot of ability to invest in consultants, you can go out and do stuff, but to have the GBCA recognise it and to make it easier for all of industry to access. So it brings the thinking. It's been fantastic for us. If we look at we've got a reconciliation action plan, but through looking at the credits and the criteria, we actually take that wrap out to our sites and we involve all of our workers so they get inducted into our reconciliation action plan. So instead of it just being our people, it then starts the ripple effect going out into the industry, and I think that's really important for moving it forward.
And Susan, from your experience working with companies, what do you consider to be the significance of this?
A reconciliation action plan can give you a framework to work within. It's not the be-all and end-all. And what really matters is the relationship that you create with First Nations communities and individuals. RAP plans are great to a certain extent, but unless you embed a community engagement strategy in and around it, so wherever your offices are across the country, or whether it's in a capital city or country area, who is within your ecosystem and how do you have the relationship with them? And yes, a RAP plan can give you an ability to engage with other organisations in terms of a partnership that you're doing in terms of the construction of the building. But really, fundamentally, it's about the relationship that you have with country and ground first, and then with the community in which the build is going to happen, and even prior to the build with the architectural designs and architects actually having the relationship with community, because otherwise it's a tick a box exercise for organisations, and you get to look great and we still get to live in the situation that we live in. So it is about empowerment, it is about us being able to engage, whether it's in different sections of the project, so we are being engaged into the economy as well. It's also about that deep listening and being okay with an uncomfortable truth. That there have been many truths that have happened in the history of what you know as Australia, and we are still coming through the intergenerational trauma of that, and how can people be okay with listening to those truths? And you know, the country, there's been a level of cognitive dissonance for such a long time. That's shifting, and that's a really good thing. But when we're not mature enough as a nation to have sensible conversations around January 26th, then what are we doing? But also the deep listening, so it shifts your thinking in how you do your job. So it's not about just taking things that you think are relevant to what you're doing. It's really for us to share knowledge with you that then you can shift change and create things from a different lens and from a different practice, and then hopefully you'll be able to have better relationships with us in terms of projects that you're doing. And there was one other point that I was going to make, and it's gone. It'll probably come back, and
yeah, we can always come back to you. And
no, sorry. The ISIT rights, the cultural rights that we have are not recognised by Australian law. That's an issue. So if people share things, if communities share things with you and you love it and you start to embed it, you're only allowed to do it for that project. You can't continue to assume all of that cultural knowledge and then take it as your own and then use it and commercialise it. You constantly have to come back to the people who share that knowledge with you, because the Australian law doesn't protect us, which is an issue. That was it.
And Jeev, in terms of the practicalities of the design of a building, what is the significance for you?
Well, critically, it's about shifting the mindset away from Indigenous design as being somehow exotic plumage, and ultimately we need to shift from the muralisation of culture or the commodification of culture to embed it within the DNA of the design thinking. And what that underscores is there's some real, I guess, powerful narratives that are encoded in country that we can reveal as part of design inspiration. But as Susan well said, it's important that we don't hoover up Indigenous knowledge and claim it as our own, that we go through the requisite cultural protocols and permissions so we get the cultural imprimatur to proceed, but also embedding reciprocity or mutual benefit, providing opportunities for Indigenous enterprise, employing Indigenous businesses. So you can see it becomes a holistic approach rather than simply an afterthought where you graft on some form of decoration. And the other important dimension there is that we look at shifting the mindset away from the museumisation of culture, whereby we think Indigenous culture is somehow set back in time. Indigenous culture is a lived culture, constantly changing, adapting and evolving through time. We wouldn't have lasted on this harsh continent for 67,000 plus years without that ability to adapt and change. But it becomes a moment and an opportunity to celebrate our shared humanity, our shared stories, and start to embed that into our design practice as just a normative part of how we think about the opportunities. And so you can see it becomes a real powerful proposition, particularly when it's done unmediated through Indigenous design practitioners.
Thank you. And you know, we've talked about engaging with the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and so Susan and Jifa, as with Indigenous people being one of the Indigenous groups being one of the most consulted in the world at the moment, how do organisations and companies find out who the local mob are and the cultural significance of the site on which their project is?
We do find ourselves in a position now where we're exhausted from the over-consultation. So being mindful of that as you approach communities. Engaging with practitioners who do this every day is a good move. So find out who local consultants are that can actually support you to connect in a really deep way with communities. So as Jifa said, you're not just hoovering up what you need. And it's really about that concept of don't just drill down and mine what you want and then just run off. It's the reciprocal relationship that you can have with us. So there is a sense that it's not just continually being taken. So have a deep, meaningful relationship with us, and start that now. Don't wait for projects to come up. We're in this situation now because we weren't seen for hundreds of years. We weren't seen, and we weren't heard. So now that there is this huge shift and movement to embed us into the process and into the sector, that's a good thing, but it's happening in every other sector as well. So we are exhausted and people are being over-consulted, and so just be respectful of that. The other thing that I say to organisations and to different sectors, swim in your own lane. Don't want to fix all the black people and all of the concerns that, you know, we show up with because of the history. Closing the gap and all of these things that are happening to try and rectify the history and our place. So it's really about understanding why people are exhausted and may not want to talk to you. And if you're behind the 8 ball already when you come to us to ask those questions and to engage us, it's probably a bit late and people are going to push back at you. So have the relationship now. Start your community engagement strategies now, with or without projects, because it's all about building the relationship so you know who to go to. Because guess what? We've been here forever, right? Like, we've not kind of moved very far, and there are people who really want to make sure that those narratives and stories are deeply embedded and that we see them showing up across the landscape in the built form. So that's exciting, but we're also exhausted in the process.
I often talk about this distinction between a transactional as opposed to a relational model, and ultimately it is about building trust, because we can't turn up on the doorstep of a local land council or traditional owner group and expect that we're going to be seen straight away, and that within the confines of a program that we can sort of flip this sort of level of engagement and insights within a small space of time. We actually have to carve out the requisite time and space to have the conversations with the right people in the room. The other important dimension is that we need to look at that we're on a spectrum of learning, and we talk about standing up and turning up, but ultimately it's about building one's cultural intelligence, and that requires an investment of time, resources and effort. And ultimately it's not about turning up with a blank page. We actually have to invest in some research and building our own capabilities, as many people don't necessarily engage on a day-to-day basis with Indigenous peoples. And so having that insight and starting to read up and starting to invest in that effort is really critical, because what that enables is to have a conversation, a meaningful conversation, rather than a unidirectional approach where one is seeking to extract information and then run off with it. And the other important dimension here is, how do we demonstrate best practice by looping back and showcasing the value of the insights of engaging with Indigenous voices? And something is valued when you actually pay for it. And so engaging with Indigenous knowledge is equivalent to engaging a geotechnical engineer where you have their specialised expertise. The knowledge holders of Indigenous culture are the traditional owners, elders and knowledge keepers. And so they require recompense for their valuable inputs and insights as part of the co-design process. So you can see the importance of valuing Indigenous knowledge is certainly critical as well. So we can see, you know, there is many steps that one can take to actually build that.
A really good starting point is, and what comes off when we have our rights and we are healthy, happy and whole people and communities, then the work that Jeff is talking about becomes easy because you have an understanding of why it's important to engage with us, and we have rights around that, and then paying for that knowledge like you would for anybody else in that food chain of the production project. I come from a television background. But it really gives us the right to be there to inform and a right to be paid.
Thank you both, that was very insightful. So other than the Indigenous inclusion credit, how else has the industry demonstrated its commitment to reconciliation? And this one's open to all panellists.
Off we go.
Thanks, Susan, for throwing me straight under it. I couldn't wait till last. So I think, as I talked before, the industry's come a long way. Certainly, you know, in my short time in it, over 30 years, we never used to have these conversations. It was actually too hard to have. It wasn't that people didn't believe in it, but it wasn't too hard to have. People didn't feel comfortable, and I think to a degree we still don't feel comfortable. We're still coming to terms with that. So I think the first part is we're having the conversation. We're here. That's fantastic. You know, listening this morning on the radio, you know, we're talking about expanding the War Memorial, but we're not talking about frontier wars. But we're talking about it. So whether it happens this time or next time, you know, I don't recall that conversation in my childhood, in my education, or any industry talk. So the fact that we're doing it now, yeah, it's not going to change the world tomorrow, and our reconciliation action plan is not going to change the world tomorrow. But the talking about it, the education, you know, we're talking about it in design meetings now. That didn't happen when I was growing up doing construction. So we're starting to think about authenticity of materials, about, you know, this space here. The reason why we've got such a big welcoming space at the beginning is because we talked about Indigenous design and around the culture of welcoming. So to start to create that. So again, that doesn't change the world, but through educating our subcontractors, they then learn more, they tell their kids, it goes out. So I think the more we talk about it, the better we'll be. We need to continue to have the strong and hard conversations. I agree 100% with that. It shouldn't be just a one-off sort of meeting to get your tick in your wrap. You need to create those relationships. You know, at SHAPE we've got strong relationships with like Urungai Learning Centre at Waterloo, at the settlement Redfern. So we have, you know, Give Back Week and that sort of stuff. But it's where our staff can get involved with people and create the relationship first, and then second, actually ask for assistance in our cultural learning. So I think it's keep doing what we're doing, but we probably need to turn up the heat a little bit, which I feel, again, in my short time of awareness with antennas up, is getting better, but I'm sure it must be frustrating to those that have known about it and have been aware of it for far longer than I have.
Yeah, and if you think of all the creative endeavours that Indigenous people are involved in, whether it's music or film or art or dance, we punch above our weight. But ultimately, the built and natural environment is kind of the last bastion of creative expression by Indigenous people, and it provides an opportunity, because if we think about it, of all the creative disciplines, the built and natural environment is most viscerally connected to country. It is anchored in place. So it becomes a moment where we can actually harness that connection and those stories. And interestingly, in recent times, the Architects Accreditation Council has now mandated a cultural dimension to be embedded as part of accrediting architecture degrees and as part of your registration process to become an architect. So you can see that the landscape is shifting, and it starts at that early phase of design education. One of the roles that I play at the University of Melbourne is to actually indigenise the design degree. And what that really does is it embeds from the outset the opportunity to engage with Indigenous perspectives in design education as part of that normative experience. And so that's really powerful, because it enables us to, I guess, shape the younger generation coming through. But interestingly, they're actually pushing for this. They're demanding this. They're saying, well, why are we not engaging with a relationship with Indigenous culture through design education? So it's actually happening from the bottom down. But interestingly too, we see, for instance, that the Institute of Architects now have a cultural reference panel and working group. The Planning Institute of Australia has endorsed the Uluru Statement of the Heart. The Australian Institute of Landscape Architects have a Reconciliation Action Plan. So you can see the peak bodies are actually starting to engage with this meaningfully. And so we're certainly seeing, I guess, the sprouts of positivity and opportunity here, and it's quite encouraging.
And I guess doing your homework's really important. That, you know, Jeff, we're talking about reconciliation action plans and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and, you know, engaging with our knowledge holders and how we can embed some of these principles through education and learning. Being able to understand who you're engaging with, and, you know, having a reference group to be able to check in with, so there is a level of you're talking to the right people, and it's an authentic engagement. So the work that you do is has deep principle in it, because there are a lot of people who step into this space, and it's really about being able to just do that checks and balances, so to speak, about making sure that they're people of country. And yes, there are many organisations that will assert themselves in the space, but who has bloodline to country, who has ancestry to country, and making sure that you're speaking to those elders and knowledge holders, and that you build a really beautiful relationship into the future. And they're people that you can, you know, double check things with and make sure that what you're doing is actually authentic and real.
So if I, again, just reflect back on in Green Star and what we've sought to do with the buildings rating tool, basically all of what you've spoken about, we've tried to incorporate into the rating tool. So there's while we're talking today quite a bit about the Indigenous inclusion credit, there's touch points across a number of different credits as well. And really the principle behind that was that if this is done properly and authentically, as we're speaking of, then it should help in a number of ways. So there is like a social procurement sort of credit, which again links back to pay me for my knowledge. There is a culture, heritage and identity credit, which has the engagement part of it. And again, I think what we've heard today is like, this isn't a consultation. There's a big difference between consulting and engaging. And so that credit really is trying to, again, draw that distinction. And also within the nature category, there are credits in there which again really touch on the not only the building but also the landscaping and incorporating that knowledge into the design of the landscaping and the local plants as well. But I suppose like going back, and this is a funny story that I might share around how not to do it, which is when you know, so you know, we're not perfect either, and I know that the consulting versus the deeper engagement and having that deeper relationship is something that I didn't do very well when I was working on that particular credit, because I did call GFA and say, hey GFA, we've got a couple of weeks before this rating tool's going to be released, can you like review this credit for me? And he very kindly and very beautifully and gently basically said, no, because this isn't a tick box, Alham. And so I think, yeah, that the key advice is, you know, do it properly and build the relationships, not just when you need it. When I'm like, oh crap, I've got to get this out, and I haven't done my engagement like I should have, you know, do it properly and build the relationships before the project even sort of commences. And it will unlock, you know, it will blow your mind, to be honest with you. If you do it properly and you do that deep listening, it will blow your mind. And you need to do it in a really respectful way. And like you said, Susan, don't exhaust people by, I think that's a really important thing, and certainly like a lesson that I learned when, you know, previous to this particular role, because, you know, there was lots of, oh, can we, you know, do this engagement? And there were so many projects, and it was like, why don't we try and all coordinate amongst ourselves and go to these individuals in a coordinated manner, because otherwise they're getting approached by 50 different projects all at once, wanting their attention right now. So I think the other part of your question was around the built environment and how that's moved as well. I mean, I think, and as we've spoken about today, it has a really positive role to play. And, you know, I only hope that sort of work that you're doing with trying to get students to really embed this right from the beginning will really pay dividends into the future. I'm positive that it will. But I mean, I've sort of seen how that's happened within the built environment, and there's multiple different ways besides a rating tool like Green Star that I'm seeing it take shape.
Really quick story. I was just sharing before. It's almost like I can feel when an Indigenous architect has designed a building. And in the Northern Sydney region at Northern Beaches TAFE College, we had Dylan Cumberberry probably 20 years ago, before all of this stuff became very fashionable to do. He's an Indigenous architect, and he comes from that very cultured principle place. Before any soil was turned, he was out talking to community, understanding what the totems were, understanding what the story of country was, and we loved the engagement. He came back with designs, and we were kept informed every point of the way. There is a learning centre in the middle of the bush at Northern Beaches College that is the most beautiful, insanely engaging building. It has a sense of indoors, outdoors. When you actually stand back and look at it from a distance, it's actually a breaching whale. But if you didn't know it, and you didn't know the totem stories of the whale people up and down the coast, you may or may not see it. But walking into that space is almost sacred. And if I hadn't have known that an Indigenous architect had done that, it just feels different. It's embedded on country, it's story from country. We as the community were deeply engaged. We had a respect for Dylan. We had a comfortability to share our stories with Dylan. And it's just the way Indigenous architects see the world, feel the world, design spaces. It's just different. And we want to share that with you, so when you approach new projects, that you come from a very different lens and a place of different sensibilities. And you'll only learn that from us. So have the relationship with us.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. So I'd like a big round of applause for our 4 panellists. And if you have any questions for them, feel free to grab them after this and ask them to share their further insights. I would also like to thank Shared Knowledge. They are an Indigenous company that catered today's event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.